The McKay interview is sponsored by the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, preparing leaders for new challenges in international security.
Hello everyone. Once in a very rare blue moon, one gets the chance to meet someone truly exceptional and who's been blessed with a long life, razor-sharp intellect, great lucidity and precise memory. My guest today is one such person. Sir Peter Marshall was born in 1924, yes? That's what I said, 1924, and served in the Royal Air Force in the final years of World War II. He joined the UK diplomatic service in 1949, rising to become Economic Under-Secretary in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, then Deputy to Britain's Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York. He served in Geneva as Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations from 1979 to 1983. From 83 to 88, he was Commonwealth Deputy Secretary General, then Chairman of the Commonwealth Trust and Royal Commonwealth Society, and after that, Chairman of the Joint Commonwealth Societies Council. He's the author of many erudite essays and papers, as well as a number of important books, including Public Diplomacy, which he wrote some 20 years ago. Now, I had the privilege of meeting him last year in a public debate on Brexit, in which I was Master of Ceremonies at the Royal Overseas League in London, where we are recording this interview today. Hello, Sir Peter. Thanks for making time for me, for coming to Overseas House this morning.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased having a chance of talking to you again, Michael, and very pleased to discussing the sort of issues we're going to look at during our interview.
It's really good to see you again, Peter. We're going to talk mainly about Brexit today, and even non-British listeners to World Radio Switzerland recognise the significance of that unexpected and consequential British referendum in June 2016. But we're going to examine Brexit mainly from the point of view of outcomes. Now, so much has happened since the referendum vote in June last year. Terrorist attacks in London, Manchester, Mrs May's badly miscalculated snap general election, resulting in her weakened political position, the terrible fire in the Grenfell Tower block here in London, the fractiousness of nature of British party politics. So much has happened that many people here, the media included, seem to notice more the process than the end result of leaving the EU. Now, I know you've yourself have written and spoken extensively on the topic, and there are few, if any, diplomats still active who have the span not only of memory, but of high-level experience that you have had. And I'm very pleased that you've agreed to share your experiences and opinions with me and our listeners. But before we deal with Brexit and its outcomes, let's benefit from your long view and vast experience by putting the present day into a little context, at least post-war, when so much happened to shape our lives today, and when, on quite a few occasions, you were personally involved and knew many of the important players of those times. Now, in 1945, you were 21 years old. I have a flurry of questions. What had you done in the war? What did you end up doing immediately after the war? Describe the mood in the UK and continental Europe, and what is your recollection? I mean, what do you remember of the optimism, the good efforts, the strains and stresses to put Europe back together again? And what are the salient points that to this day you remember when you see current events echo actions taken all those years ago, or alternatively, when you see political actions and behaviour which run counter to the mood and the spirit of the times when you were a young diplomat? So, Peter, it's a rather long start to our interview, but over to you.
Yes, it is a very interesting, not a question, but a series of questions. I think we would begin by saying that the overwhelming sentiment among a lot of people was still to be alive. That faced, secondly, with an enormous scale of destruction all over Europe, including, of course, in our own country, combined in the case of the British with the feeling that what had happened before was simply should never be repeated. And this we faced up both in the introduction of the welfare state and a whole raft of domestic reforms, including in education, health, and the whole management of the economy, combined, of course, with the magnificent construction of the post-war fabric for cooperation, especially in the United Nations system. But beyond that, there was, of course, two very difficult problems to face. The first was that the Cold War broke out almost immediately. And so that we thought, are we going to be back in all this again? There was, of course, a dramatic moment, the Berlin airlift, when the blockade of Berlin occurred in the autumn of 1948. Secondly, of course, there was this tremendous load of destruction, and were faced at the same time with the threat of the Red Army being able to march into all over Europe rather than the parts allocated to it. And then we had, first of all, the Marshall Plan, no relation, unfortunately, General Marshall, his speech at Harvard, where he was offering substantial American support to the Europeans if they could get themselves together, which they did under what subsequently became the OECD, and very much under British leadership. But that wasn't enough. For those on the continent of Europe, there was a yearning to realign politically. And this first found expression, of course, in the Schuman Plan of the Schuman Declaration, we say, was more accurate, of 1950.
Mr. Peter, now that brings me perfectly to my first European question. In your opinion, was the European project from the outset a political one? And did Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman really have it in mind to create political union rather than economic union?
No. The answer is, I'm sure, that it all began by an ever closer union of peoples. Now, what does that involve in practical arrangements? There was a certain sacrifice of supranationality in the first original proposition, which was placing coal and steel production in France and Germany under collective international management. And that, of course, was something which didn't appeal to the Labour government in Britain, because having just nationalised the coal and steel industries, we were not in the business of handing it over to somebody else.
I see. Okay, well, let's move on to more current times. Thanks to the miscalculation of the former Prime Minister David Cameron in calling a referendum that he thought he would win, the UK is now on the way out. Article 50 has been triggered. Negotiations in Brussels have started. Posturing seems in full flow. Advice and criticism, at least for and of the British side, seem plentiful. I have to ask you this question before we get into the meat of outcomes of Brexit. I have to ask you this question because I'm a long-term resident of Switzerland and you once lived there, so you know something about the political culture. How would you characterise the risks to a parliamentary democracy like the UK of toying only very occasionally with referendums and direct democracy, similar but not the same as Switzerland?
Well, in Switzerland, surely they know more about referendums than anybody else in the world, and they seem to manage it extremely well. Mind you, it is consistent with a very cautious international policy, neutrality, of course, in particular. In Britain, yes, there's always a readiness to criticise the referendum as being people answering the wrong question or the right question for the wrong reasons or whatever it may be. Of course, one of the great jokes of classical diplomacy is that you can't translate the phrase public opinion into this, that, or the other language. The nearest you can get is the stupid people. Now, I mean, the answer to me, I would say, of course, I was surprised by the referendum result. I was a Remainer, but I respect the fact that 17 million people in this country, an enormous number, voted to leave. Why? Not because of their detailed knowledge of the working of the EU, of l'acquis communautaire, if you like, but because they felt that the EU was going in directions which were fundamentally uncongenial. Now, Britain and Switzerland, of course, share this great privilege of an enormous continuity of institutions. We don't need to think we need some other arrangement. We're not even really ready to contemplate it. I once heard Lord Attlee, this was in 1957 at a meeting, in fact in Lausanne, arranged by the Quakers, said, well, is Britain part of Europe or not? To which he replied, we're semi-detached.
It's the famous quotation, isn't it?
Now, that phrase, of course, means very little when you translate it into other languages. But in Britain, it has all the resonance to explain what is going on.
Let's move on a little bit to what's going on today. What advice would you give, if you were asked, what advice would you give to David Davis, the UK's Minister in charge of exiting the EU? And what advice would you give to Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, to obtain the most satisfactory settlement for their respective sides of the negotiations?
Yes, I think my advice to them both would be, this is not a question of a zero-sum game. This, above all, is a positive-sum game where we, in regard of our responsibilities to the rest of the world, have got to come up with a positive solution which is of benefit to everybody else as well as to ourselves. Now, my problem is that there seems to be a very strong sentiment still in the European Union that somehow we are guilty of a crime of some sort by wishing to leave, and we have to be punished. And if not punished, then the phrase in the guidelines produced by the European Council in response to Mrs. May's letter of March 29 is countries which become non-member states cannot expect to enjoy the same benefits as member states. Well, the answer is that, of course not. I mean, nobody is expecting that. What Mrs. May is asking is the closest possible arrangement respecting the views of the community, especially the integrity of the four freedoms.
Good. So we've arrived now to look a little bit ahead to 2 years' time. Today I'm in London. My guest is Sir Peter Marshall, a distinguished British diplomat whose experience dates back to 1949 and who was once also the UK's permanent representative to the UN in Geneva. Sir Peter, now let's look ahead to outcomes. What outcomes should Britain aim for?
Okay, I think this goes back to the same question, is that if you look at the international community as a whole, it has got to be something which is of benefit to them. We could say that when Britain joined the European Union, or the EEC as it then was, in 1973, we had a world economy. 40 years later, we are evolving into a global village. Now that means that the operations of individual countries is far more integrated, both as to their internal affairs and their external affairs, with the concerns and interests of the rest of the world. And if Mr. David Davis and Mr. Barnier do not come up with a negotiated package which respects this fundamental truth, I would regard them as having failed in their international responsibilities.
And what framework should Britain be aiming to agree with the EU for a harmonious and mutually productive future relationship? Give me a little bit more detail about how you see that. I mean, you've been involved in these things over many years.
Yes, of course, the great question that we say is really sort of trade, and then what else? Now, coming to trade, of course, what one looks at is what is the situation within the World Trade Organization now? This is an organization which was in its infancy when I was at the coalface. I have watched it grow. It is now, in my view, it deals with an enormous collection of problems which you can't call trade in the traditional sense of the exchange of goods across frontiers. What what the World Trade Organization is dealing is with well-being, the wealth of nations, to use Adam Smith's expression.
So, just to go back a little bit, because these are phrases that come up often in the British press and out of the mouths of politicians. What is your view about descriptive words like hard Brexit and soft Brexit? Do they really serve any purpose at all?
No, my view is they are meaningless. In fact, not only meaningless, but positively misleading. Because what hard and soft means is how far do they derogate from the exact arrangements of the Treaty of Rome and the single market regulations as they now are. We're not asking for that. We're saying, look, we respect the integrity of the four principles, that we realise that we can't be part of the single market as a non-member, and we don't ask to be, nor do we expect to go in for what is called cherry-picking, this, that, and other, which is really cherry-picking as what it means as between the hard and soft Brexit. What we are saying is, let's use our imaginations and find a solution which corresponds to the needs of the moment and the responsibilities we bear to the rest of the international community.
At the pace of international affairs, 2 years is not a long time. What do you think can realistically be achieved in the 2-year time frame which is set by Article 50? And based on your long experience, why do you say that this can be achieved in that period of time?
Well, I think the first is that this 2-year period is a ridiculously arbitrary provision in the original Article 50, which, as you know, was not. Article 50 was part of the Constitution drafted by the Convention on the Future of Europe right at the beginning of 2003, and of course immediately rejected in referenda by France and the Netherlands. Now, the answer is, if you have this arbitrary period of 2 years, the sensible thing to do is to say, well, let us see where we are at the end of it, and that we will then arrange that whatever hasn't been completed according to the requirements, the actual legislative requirements, should be it should be understood what it is and how it should be processed later. Now, I think we usually talk in terms of a transitional period, which of course is a familiar concept to the EU, and that probably what it needs is not so much detailed negotiation as a common agreement and common sense and goodwill on both sides.
So this is a good dose of pragmatism.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which, of course, you see, Monet was the great, in history, I would say, one of the greatest disciples of pragmatism we've ever seen. And somehow, when they talk about him as the father of Europe, they think actually he was an arch-federalist. Of course, it's nonsense.
What was he?
He used to say, when he goes, "Je suis Marshal Cognac," means I'm a brandy seller. You see,
because you knew him as a young man. You knew him.
Yes. Well, but what happened was that he was still around in Paris when I arrived at the political councillor in the embassy in Paris in 1969. He used to come and have lunch at the embassy, and he'd sit at the table, Christopher Soames's hospitable lunch table, and say, "You must get into the EU and then reform it." Well, we did get into the EU, but we didn't reform it. And I think that's what he'd say to us today. You know, why didn't you do what you should have done?
Now, we started talking about people, Jean Monnet. Let's talk about somebody else. How critical, in your view, how critical is the role of the senior and most powerful EU member state leader, Mrs. Merkel? I ask you the same question, before you answer that, about the new kid on the EU bloc, France's Emmanuel Macron. How critical are those two people?
Oh, the answer is, I think in both cases, they cannot be as decisive personally as we might wish. I mean, they are President Macron is, of course, extraordinary, if you like, the product of circumstances which one could scarcely believe. I mean, obviously, he was able to articulate those in himself, but it looks as if he's going to have quite a stormy passage during his 7 years of presidency. As far as Angela Merkel is concerned, there have been a number of occasions in the past when we have looked to her, as it were, to exercise some decisive leadership. And for reasons probably of German political circumstances and the situation within her own country, which one fully respects, she has not been able to exercise that decisive leadership which we would have liked. But then you see, you have to go back to the whole idea of who was it? Oh, who's from the phrase? The man they referred to as Bismarck in a cardigan. He said there must be a European roof on Germany and not a German roof on Europe. I'll think of his name.
It'll come. Yes, I know that.
Yes, but you see, yeah, it is. I think I have enormous respect.
Was it Adenauer? Was it Adenauer? Was it Adenauer?
No,
it wasn't.
I think it
Okay, okay.
Anyway, it is. They have got an extremely interesting situation in which they now are, because they, on the one hand, they are the economic powerhouse. On the other hand, they know that to some extent German reunification was conditional upon a sort of a Europe that was not German-dominated.
Look, one more question on that
Yes.
before we move on to something quite different. Who else, in your opinion, will play a significant role in those Brexit outcomes, and why? I mean, who else is out there?
Mrs. May.
Mrs. May?
Yeah,
Yeah, but I
absolutely.
mean, we talked about it already, but tell us a little bit about Mrs. May, and then if there's anybody else that you can think of that, that would play a significant role in that.
The reason why I think this is because the whole thread of analysis and reasoning which lies behind her letter of the March the 29th, the trigger letter, is a fundamental understanding of the change which is necessary as indicated by the referendum. She said immediately that the people voted for change as well as for leaving the EU. The second thing is, she said right at the beginning, you must get out of your mind the idea of thinking only in terms of how matters have arranged in the past and think about how the future is going to look. Now that's much easier for me because I know what it was like while de Gaulle was keeping us out of the EEC in the 60s. I dealt with the EFTA, in Geneva.
The European Free Trade Area.
That's right. Well, this is the European Free Trade Association of seven countries,
yeah.
because the idea of an area, the six wouldn't have it. We tried to make it, let's talk about sixes and sevens, as you were.
Mm.
Now, we've simply got to be imaginative. And I suppose the next thing is, well, who is going to help us to be imaginative? And that's where you'll come up with things like the G20 or OECD or the Commonwealth.
So you mentioned organisations, but not particular countries.
No, I think the countries like Canada and Australia, who understand, because they're under their own situation, understand the situation extremely well. And of course, if you really want to know how to run things internationally, go and ask our Swiss friends.
My last question, because we have time is always the enemy in this, and I think we're going to have another conversation, maybe a little bit further down the track. But do you think, Sir Peter, that the Commonwealth can play any significant role? You had a senior positions in the Commonwealth. Can they play a significant role in the rehabilitation of Britain's international trade? And there's been much talk in some quarters of this, as you know. Yet the UK, it seems to me, was happy to jettison the Commonwealth in favour of its new love interest, the EEC and the EU, when it suited Britain's interests. So what role the Commonwealth?
Yeah, I think the answer is that Britain has indeed, in the last 40 years, sacrificed its sort of the links and the richness of the links with the Commonwealth in the interest of pursuing its European destiny. Now, the Commonwealth has in fact enjoyed a resurgence for reasons independent of Brexit, and that in that way it was going to meet at summit level in London and Windsor in April next year. This has given a tremendous shot in the arm by the Brexit. Now, to the point where there is a fear is, will Brexit dominate the Commonwealth meeting? I mean, to the exclusion of other interests, including, of course, the Commonwealth relations with the 27, which is something we want to have very, very much in mind. And the answer to that is that I think it could well be the other way around, that the resurgence of the Commonwealth as an entity within its symbiotic relationship with the United Nations will be able to help understand what the outcome should be of British withdrawal from the EU.
So, Peter, time is against us. Thank you so much for your invaluable insights. It's clear to me that we'll need to meet again a little bit further down the track and talk in more detail as the whole negotiation process continues. Today, my guest has been Sir Peter Marshall, the veteran and distinguished British diplomat. Sir Peter, thank you.
The McKay interview is sponsored by the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, preparing leaders for new challenges in international security.